In our game today, Magnus Carlsen plays to control one single square. He sends his knight on an incredible journey and plays a brilliant rook and bishop endgame. Let us jump right in. His opponent is John Nunn, who has the black pieces. This was played in 2006 in Amsterdam. Magnus begins with e4. John Nunn plays c5, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, d6, d4. And he plays knight to f6. Really, it's just a abnormal move order. Normally, black would take on d4 and then play knight to f6, but this really does not change much. And Magnus responds with knight to c3, defending the attacked e4 pawn, and then cd4, knight d4. And now we have a standard open Sicilian position. And John Nunn plays the Rolls Royce of Sicilians, one of the very best, a6, the Najdorf, the choice of Fischer, the choice of Kasparov. And now Magnus Carlsen plays bishop to e3, which is usually the beginning of a line known as the English attack. Of course, John Nunn, one of the legends of English chess, one of the best players in the world in his prime, and even now in his late 60s, a formidable opponent, one of the top problem solvers I know in the world. So quite Magnus playing the English opening against, or the English attack against an English player. E6 is playable here, but John Nunn plays e5, gaining more space in the center. Of course, it does create a bit of a weakness here at d5, which is the square that Magnus will try to dominate as the game goes on. Normally, knight to b3 is played here, and the English attack idea is to play f3 and g4, queen to d2, like you'd see in a Yugoslav attack against the dragon. But Magnus handles this a little bit differently. He plays the knight to f3, and I don't even know if you can properly call this an English attack anymore. Basically, he just wants to get his pieces out, play bishop to c4, and again, play to control to dominate this d5 square. Bishop to e7, bishop to c4, castles, castles, and bishop to e6 from John Nunn, directly challenging Magnus's bishop at c4. Magnus could take on e6, fe6. This is an appropriate way to play. There's nothing bad about it, but black does get a nice chunk of central pawns and control of the d5 square, so Magnus decides to just retreat the bishop back to b3 and maintain that tension between those light squared bishops. John Nunn plays knight to c6, getting his last minor piece developed. Now queen to e2 from Magnus. He wants to move his rook over to the d file, help control the d5 square, hit the d6 pawn, and of course indirectly pressure the queen at d8. Knight to a5 from John Nunn, going after the bishop pair, attacking that bishop at b3. Now rook f to d1, continuing the idea. Knight takes b3, and here we already begin to see the difference between Magnus and other players. Most players would just reflexively play a b3 here, capturing towards the center. But Magnus plays c b3. He figures, obviously it makes it easier for a knight maybe to come to d4, but this knight at f6 really can never get to that square, so he's not worried about it. So what he wants to do is open up the c file. So if, say, queen to c7, which is the natural square for black's queen in these lines, then rook a to c1, and he's already threatening a discovery. So now the queen can't comfortably go to c7. So queen to e8 is played. Magnus could play bishop g5 here, threatening to take the knight that controls the d5 square. But instead, he begins a very powerful knight journey. The knight at f3 obviously doesn't have much future on this square. It's limited. So he plays knight to e1. The idea is to play the knight to c2, or it could go to d3, either way. Then go to b4 to control this d5 square. So knight f3, e1, c2, b4, d5 is the idea. But now John Nunn plays h6. So this idea of bishop g5, taking off that knight at f6, is no longer on the table for white. Magnus just continues his journey. Knight to c2, queen to d7, connecting the rooks, and knight to b4. And this knight has traveled a lot. f3, d4, f3, and then back to e1, c2, b4. And it's all about controlling this key d5 square. Rook f to c8, placing the rook on the only completely open file. And now f3, adding to the strength of the center. The e4 pawn was only defended by the knight at c3, so making that e pawn stronger. Bishop goes to d8. It wants to activate itself somewhere and not be limited on the e7 square. Magnus plays rook to d3, preparing to double on the d file and attack d6. also enhancing his control over this d5 square, which we've established is very important. John Nunn plays a5, hits the knight at b4, and forces a decision. Obviously, was already going to d5. He knew it was going to land there. So he takes the knight off with his knight. The knight recaptures. Now, he could take that knight with his bishop if he wanted to. The problem is after rook to d5, Magnus has a total bind on the position. The other rook is coming. And also compare the bishops. White's dark squared bishop is a good piece. Black's is a bad piece because its central pawns block its mobility. So this will be a very nice position for Magnus. So John Nunn does not take that knight. Instead, he plays a4, trying to open lines of attack on the queen side. Pawn takes, rook takes a4, and here Magnus plays b3. Now he's kicking the rook away, but he's also preparing to play a4. You'll notice these two pawns on the queen side make up a healthy 2 versus 1 pawn majority. So he wants to begin advancing those pawns, and this b3 moves gives him a tempo to do it. Rook a to a6 from John Nunn. That defends d6 laterally, but now rook a to d1. And here, perhaps Black's best move is f5, undermining that e-pawn a little bit, maybe opening up the f-file that he can take advantage of later. But he plays rook to a5. Now, he had just played the rook to a6, which means this move is a loss of tempo. And at this level, a loss of tempo is very risky. And Magnus immediately punishes this idea with a surprising move. This knight has made such a long journey to land on d5, you wouldn't think he would move it. But he does. He plays the move knight to b6. Now, obviously, this is hitting the queen and the rook here, and that basically forces its capture. So what he's doing, he's actually creating a position with opposite colored bishops, which you would think would give Black drawing chances. And it does a little bit, but there's one problem. This move actually wins a pawn. After this move, there's no way to defend d6. First, the capture is forced. Bishop takes b6, and then when White recaptures, he's hitting the rook. So he's gaining a tempo there, and also attacking d6 twice. So the rook moves to a6, and now rook takes d6. Magnus has won a pawn. But he does have those opposite colored bishops, but he has a very strong position with the two rooks, and now an extra pawn. The queen goes to e7. Magnus plays to b2, continuing the threats, aiming at the e5 pawn. The queen can get behind these queenside pawns as well. Queen to g5 from John Nunn. That defends e5, and it might be able to get in on these dark squares in White's central position. a4 advancing the a pawn, and it looks like maybe he could actually play rook takes b6 here, with the idea of rook takes rook and queen to e3 check with a double attack on the rook and the king. But that doesn't work because Magnus would have this move, queen to f2, blocking the check, and the queen from f2 defends the rook, and White would just win a piece in that case. So instead, John Nunn advances his h-pawn up the board to unsettle White's kingside position. Magnus just continues advancing his queenside pawn majority. h4 continues advancing the majority. If John Nunn plays h3 here, then rook to d8 gets off a pair of rooks. And after the king moves, queen to d2, offering the exchange of queens and keeping g2 defended. And White is in very good shape here. So with the b pawn advancing, it's going to hit the a rook. So the rook goes back to a8. Queen to d2, offering the exchange of queens. Up a pawn and having an advanced pawn majority, Magnus wants to go into the endgame. And as it turns out, John Nunn goes ahead and does so. The problem is, if he doesn't, these heavy pieces are just too powerful to overcome. So the queens do come off the board. The rooks are still very powerfully placed. John Nunn plays rook to c4, attacking the b pawn. Bishop to c5 defends the pawn. Rook to c8. And now rook to b6, directly attacking the b7 pawn. Rook to c7 defends it. And now Magnus plays king to f2, beginning to centralize that king. Black's king cannot go to f8 because the bishop at c5 controls it, so he has to enter through the side. King to h7. And now bishop to d6, an attack on the rook and the pawn at e5. So rook to d7 pins that bishop so that he cannot take the pawn at e5. But now king to e3 protects the rook, and now he is threatening to take the pawn at e5. So, what does John Nunn do? He plays f6, looking like it defends the pawn at e5. The problem is, now this bishop at e6 is undefended, and that allows Magnus to take the pawn anyway, which he does. Bishop takes e5, coming across and threatening this bishop at e6. If rook d2, king d2, fe5, rook e6, rook b4, we end up with basically the same endgame we have that occurs in the game through a different move order. Here he takes the bishop first, then after rook takes e6, then the rooks are exchanged. So we have a rook endgame. John Nunn takes on b4, and he's going to try to survive this and hopefully get some pressure on the 7th rank, maybe eat the g2 pawn. But Magnus goes ahead and takes on e5, rook to b2 check, king to c3, rook to g2, but this actually doesn't win a pawn because of this move from Magnus. Rook to h5 check, king g6, rook takes h4. And if he were to play rook to f2, just a move like rook to f4 holds the position for Magnus. But instead, John Nunn plays rook to a2, attacking the a pawn from behind. But after simply king to b4, in this position, the great British Grandmaster John Nunn resigns because he's down 2 pawns, and Magnus is just in a wonderful position, and there's just no way he's going to be able to hold this endgame against Magnus Carlsen. I hope you enjoyed this game and hope you found it educational. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.